there'll be serious commercial, economic consequences because Asia is integrating very rapidly. They're signing lots of trade agreements with each other. Asians trade more with each other than they do with Europe or with America. So if we launch these trade wars, then we wind up cutting ourselves off from their trade with each other because that's going to happen. And that's going to mean that our multinational companies are going to have lower revenues. Their share prices, their valuations, their market cap are going to fall. So that's one very significant consequence of having the wrong policy towards Asia, which is presently what we do have. But again, when I say we, I really only mean Trump's America. I don't mean Canada. I don't mean the West, because one of the things that I explain in great detail and length in the book is Europe's attitude towards Asia is very different. Europe is embracing these new Silk Roads. Europe wants the Belt and Road Initiative to flourish. Europe wants to have high-speed railways connecting, Britain and Germany all the way to China, because they're the ones who are exporting even more to Asia than we are. So it's critical to realize that we should open our eyes and to see what others are doing more successfully and to learn from them before it's too late.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
And hey, welcome back to Think Bigger, Think Better. And today it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Parag Khanna to talk about his new book, The Future is Asian. Before chatting to Parag, let me draw attention to our two previous episodes. One is on plastics in the ocean, which is very scary, and one is on evolutionary biology that seeks answers to the question, are we humans still evolving, and in which direction? And following this episode, we will have an interview with one of today's experts on behavioral science, Kelly Monahan. I describe behavioral science as the new black in business. Why are businesses going gaga for behavioral science? What does it do? Where do we see it? And what are the advantages? And after that, we're going to have another episode on the environment, this time on straws. Did you know that we dispose of enough straws per day to circle the Earth 2.5 times? Do we really need all those straws? What are the costs of all that? I also want to give a shout out to my 4 newest Patreon subscribers. It means so much to me that you support this podcast. Really, really thank you. So thank you to Karen Deal, Ariane Overvater, Rhonda St. Croix, and Stein Christensen. Thank you. I'm going to be sending you a free copy of one of my books, a free chapter of another book, and for patrons in the $5 category, an invitation to join a recording with one of my guests. And finally, on an exciting note, I'm nearing completion of my book, Behaviors and Influence. It will certainly be the best writing I've ever done. If you want early releases of that, join my mailing list at paulgibbons.net. So on to today's show. In the 19th century, the world was Europeanized. In the 20th century, it was Americanized. And now in the 21st century, the world is being Asianized. Well, what does that mean? And is it true? According to our guest, Parag Khanna, the Asian century is even bigger than you think. Far greater than just China, the new Asian system taking shape is a multi-civilizational order spanning Saudi Arabia to Japan and Russia to Australia, linking 5 billion people through trade, finance, and infrastructure networks that represent 40% today of global GDP. And as, of course, you know, that percentage is growing dramatically. Parag, our guest, is an author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with the Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order. In 2008, Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He's been an advisor to the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2030 program. From 2013 to 2018, he was a senior research fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And from 2006 to 2015, he was a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation. He's a CNN Global contributor. His 2008 cover story for the New York Times, Waving Goodbye to Hegemony, was one of the most globally detailed and influential. He also appears frequently in media around the world, CNN, BBC, CNBC, Al Jazeera, and other broadcasters. His TED Talks have been viewed several million times. So let's welcome Parag for round 2 with Parag Khanna. Parag, welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better. You know, funny, you're my first repeat offender.
Is that right? Oh, I'm honored, deeply honored.
Yeah, well, you seem to be able to produce a book about every 9 months or so these days.
I like to say it's the closest thing a man can come to having a baby. After all, is the labor involved in doing a book.
Yeah, and I guess what did you say? A lecture a day keeps the doctor away. So you're working
There
the
is
circuit
that,
now.
especially when you're on book tour. Indeed.
So you were just at Davos. Do you mind sharing with listeners some of what you found surprising or interesting or unusual about Davos this year? I guess you're a repeat offender there. You go most years, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I have lost count, so no point in it's more than 10 and less than 20. But this year was perhaps so unremarkable at some level because there was a certain banality and predictability to the fact that you had lame duck kind of Western leaders, the Macrons and Merkel types. Trump didn't even come, Theresa May didn't come. You had kind of populist firebrands who, again, they're curiosities more than they are strategically significant people like Bolisario, Brazil. So it wasn't really in that sense interesting, at this point there. And also, I think for me, the big divide was, and it's obviously a big theme of this book as well, kind of East and West, where populist politics of Western societies and the gloominess about slow growth versus everyone else, coming from Asia, Africa, and elsewhere that's really focused on globalization, trade, moving up the value chain, high growth rates and so forth. So, even though people accuse Davos of being like a filter bubble, and much worse, of course, as well, it's actually internally quite bifurcated as well, at least bifurcated, if not trifurcated, into different kind of, communities that have different things on their minds and different kind of sentiments.
And so what were the different preoccupations, would you say, of the East and West from your point of view at Davos?
West, because I think this interesting topic is the notion that there is no unified West. Canada
Right.
is not that much like America these days. I mean, Canadians
Yes,
are much
yes,
more
yes.
like Western Europeans, whereas there is this Anglo-American, in other words, America and United Kingdom,
Yeah.
our populist politics, driving ourselves into an abyss, that is a particular predicament or malady right now. And it's not global. People talk about populism, protectionism, xenophobia, you fill in the blank, as if it's afflicting the whole world. It's really just us. We are the dumb ones.
That's
Us.
funny, and it's really easy. It's really easy to see ourselves as being paradigmatic, but in fact, we don't. In fact, often enough, see ourselves as being. It's an American exceptionalism in a different way, right? We refuse to see ourselves as exceptional in this respect.
Exactly right. And this is an area in which you don't want to be exceptional. You don't want to be exceptionally dumb. You don't want to have,
Right.
sort of backwards looking politics that's self-destructive, right? While much of the world is going in another direction. And again, that's part of what motivated me to write this book, because I moved to Asia a few years ago, living in Singapore, traveling around the region. And I see so much as just the opposite of what our problems are. The optimism, the openness, the pro-globalization sentiment, all of that is how you would characterize Asia today. So it's been a real eye-opening experience to go live there and to travel around all the countries in the region.
I bet it has. I bet it has. I mean, even though you're Asian by origins very far back, you're Swiss. Are you Swiss national or German national? I can't recall.
No. I mean, I did spend time in Germany growing up, but we moved to America when I was about 6. So, I've basically become a New Yorker as much as anything. One
God
of
help
the
you.
one of the threads, one of the threads in the book is the notion of how I grew up as an Asian American, which is of course the term for people like me, who are like ethnically Asian, but growing up and assimilating in America, you're an Asian American. But now I call myself an American Asian, an American who's going back to Asia and trying to fit in Asia, the place he's supposed to be from. And
Right.
that term didn't exist. I coined it, and it's in the book.
Oh.
So it's
Cool.
sort of, and if you think about it, it's not a term we ever thought we would need, because you never thought that people would ever go back to the East or go back to Asia. I mean, these poor, feudal, agrarian, socialist, backwards countries. Why would anyone go back? But now you look at them today, and they've got the smart cities and the financial centers and the innovation and the seamless, high quality life and all this kind of stuff. Is what you're starting to see in Asia. So a lot has changed in the last one generation.
I sort of understand your predicament. I grew up in the United States but moved to Europe, so I was always an American living in Europe. it confers certain benefits, and also, you're always, sort of culturally an outsider to some extent. And then I moved back a dozen years ago to the United States, and so I've been in Europe 30 years, so I'm considering myself very much identity-wise a European. And now I'm back in the United States with an American accent, and of course, but European values. So again, I'm no longer really, at home. It's a particular weird thing. There's an expression, I think, you can never go home.
Yeah,
You can never go
it's
home.
interesting news. I don't hear many people so candidly say that they subscribe to European values, even if you're not European, because it's very uncommon to have that kind of awareness of how different the value systems are in the West. And for me, I totally agree with you, because from the time that I lived in Germany growing up, and multiple times that I've lived there, I've definitely picked up the certain European values as well. And there's a clear distinction, really, like I said before, between the kind of Anglo-American way of running a country and an economy versus the continental European way. And those of us who have lived in, a place like a Germany or Switzerland, certainly it sticks with you.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, I haven't spent enough time in Asia. I'd love to hear more about the book. Congratulations on what number book is this? This is your sixth book or something like that. So something like that.
Counting.
I don't know if I'm accurately counting though. That's the thing.
You are indeed.
All right. Okay, cool. Well, tell us a little bit about the future of Asian. I guess quickly, I just begin with, what's your motivation? Why write it? Why, of all of the topics, you're a polymath and polycultural and polyglot and poly lots of things. So you could have written a lot of books. Why this one?
Well, I think, this one was just, well, there's two reasons. One is, when I write a book, there's an itch that I want to scratch, and that's usually an intellectual bone to pick, or an argument, or a disagreement with the mainstream. So that was certainly.
Otherwise, why write it? Right.
Exactly.
Why live in the echo chamber and say what everybody else is saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there needs to be this sense that, what I'm reading about Asia is incorrect. It needs to be fixed, and I'm not going to sleep well, until I've done so. And that was certainly the case here, because we've had, 20 years of books about Asia. However, they're all actually about China. They're not really about Asia, and China is part of Asia, and it's an important part of Asia, but it isn't all of Asia itself. There's 3.5 billion people in Asia who are not Chinese. It's an obvious fact. It's so blindingly obvious that, it's almost frightening that I have to say it. And yet when I say it, it bowls people over. So now is the time to start to understand that Asia is much bigger than China, especially with the Chinese economy slowing and other economies rising quickly, and corporate America looking for new sources of growth as China does slow. It's like, hello, everyone. There's another several billion Asian citizens and customers that are younger, very dynamic societies, fast growing. So that's one reason why that I wrote the book. And the other is, also personal, cultural, you might say. Again, as I said, moving back there and living there and experiencing the vibe really has had a powerful impact on me. And in that sense, this book is not new. There's a lot of continuity, with my books. One picks up where the other is left off, in observing how the world changes over time, and what the biggest change is at any given time, is going to be kind of my subject of interest. And I'll try and take both a top down and a bottom up.
I got it. And, it's funny, I have to confess, when I saw,
yeah.
When I saw The Future is Asian, I did think China. So I'm steeped in the same ignorance as the rest of us, in some respect, the same paradigm as the rest of us. So talk us through some of the points in the book, if you will, some of the economic. I guess it's economic and cultural, very much economic and cultural, as far as
it's a very, very geopolitical, but geopolitics encompasses everything else as well. It's national willpower and cultural confidence, but it's also macroeconomics and trade integration. It's all of those things. So, and very importantly, it's also history. So one of the chapters of this book retells the history of the world in a mere 50 pages, but from the point of view of a kind of average Asian, or a kind of melange of an Asian. What's the sort of a blend character. Of a composite of Indian, Chinese, Persian, Southeast Asian, Japanese. How would they view the world? And that was, by the way, the hardest chapter of any book I've ever had to write, to try to sum up. Really all of human history from the Asian point of view. And it was extremely rewarding, because, again, having grown up in the US, these are things that I didn't learn in history class. And I'm very disappointed in my history teachers. Tisk, tisk, shame on them for not teaching me global history the way it should be taught. And there is a nascent field called global history. And, what I've tried to do is to contribute to that tradition in the way I've structured that narrative. So you've got the history, the economics, the geopolitics, and culture is a very strong part of this book because there is what I call the new Asian values, a new set of kind of guiding principles that a lot of Asian societies follow, whether they are democratic or authoritarian, Chinese or Indian. And that was a really interesting exercise to do as well, to put myself into the position and say, what would a Filipino and an Iranian and a Russian and a Kazakh and an Indonesian agree upon when it comes to how their country should be run? And believe it or not, I took a stab at that, and I took a stab at that, and the feedback has been really, really positive.
And that's interesting because it's often said that Japan is the most Western of all the Western countries. But that would be part of your mélange, wouldn't it? Or is Japan an outlier from your perspective?
No, absolutely not. Japan is not only very Asian, but Japan is an icon of Asia. It ranks today, as we sit here, as the most popular and the most respected country in Asia. Japan is the reason that we have this Asian growth story today, because It was the Japanese economic miracle of the post-war decades of the 50s and 60s that made it the second largest economy in the world. And it was Japan's story that inspired the next wave of countries, the tiger economies, South Korea and Taiwan and so forth. And then those countries together with Japan have been the largest investors in China over the last 40 years.
Right.
So it's extremely important.
Part of the China growth story is part of the tiger growth story as well.
Yeah, exactly. So China is not some island hovering above Asia, right? The way Trump would talk about it. China is deeply embedded in the Asian story.
So what values would you say, unite these? I mean, you talk about the Kazakhs and the Japanese and the Iranians and the Indians and the Chinese in the same breath. So what do they share values wise?
It's a great question. So the first is what I call, it's mixed capitalism, right? This is a simple one for everyone to understand. I mean, the government plays a strong role in the economy. There is intervention or subsidies, industrial policy, all of those kinds of things. No question about it. The other is technocratic governance. And what I mean there is that, there's a preference almost for a strong executive leader. It doesn't have to be an autocrat, it can be someone who's elected. Asia, as I point out in the book, is home to more people living in democracy than any other part of the world. In fact, there are more Asians living in democracies than the rest of the world put together. But again, when we often talk about Asia, we assume that some monolithic authoritarian threat emanating from China. But there's 2 billion people living in democracies in Asia, 2 billion. And in fact, most of them are having elections in the next 6 months. So it's going to be a very exciting time.
Yes. And by a technocratic, for people who didn't read your first book, how do you characterize a technocratic society or technocratic leadership?
So technocratic leadership is, selected meritocratically. It has a long-term vision of national, progress and modernization. The people trust the leader to make those long-term decisions. And again, you have a lot of that in Asia, even if they're elected or unelected, but you have a trust for the civil service, educated elite thrown out the window. Here in the U.S. and UK. And the third is what I call social conservatism. They have a very cautious and incremental approach to liberalism. They're cautious about gay rights or abolishing the death penalty or reducing media censorship. Now, some of these things are not good. We wouldn't look at that and say that's a good thing. Censorship is not a good thing. But when you spend time over here in Asia, you get a sense of why they have this cautious approach. And sometimes it has positive consequences. So if you look at social media, right, we now have politicians and citizens screaming fire in a crowded theater every day, inciting, hatred and racial tension all over the place. You cannot get away with that in an Asian country where they're so ethnically diverse. You just can't. You'll go to jail. And I think people are realizing now, maybe we need to be a bit tougher. We should not be curbing free speech, but we should be, in a way, policing fake news a lot more stringently than we do. And again, we're waking up to the negative consequences of that. In Asia, they have zero tolerance for it. And now that they've watched everything that's happened with our election and Trump and fake news and filter bubbles, they are forcing Facebook and Google and Twitter and WhatsApp to hire monitors to see that if there's fake news and lies, that are spreading virally, it has to be stopped and shut down immediately before people get killed. And again, you think about it and you say, that's not such a bad idea. So there are aspects of this social conservatism in Asia that's quite prevalent that are definitely worrying. And then there's aspects of it that are actually that we could learn from.
If you'll permit me a 10-second commercial break, Think Bigger, Think Better survives only because of the goodwill and support of its Patreon subscribers. So if you're loving the show, head over to patreon.com, Paul Gibbons, and hit that Become a Patron button. For as little as $2 a month, you get extra content, free content, can listen into recordings, and get free books. So thank you very much for your support, and back to our show. So what's happening economically? I think I just wrote in fact, it's probably about to come out in the next few days. I did a little short study on China. China's growth has fallen to 6.6%, I think, in the fourth quarter of 2018. And they're terribly disappointed with that. The United States, I don't think, has had a growth quarter that strong since the 50s. I think 1955, it had 8% growth. So, forgive me if I'm out by a few years or so on that. So that's an incredible story, that they are disappointed by the kind of growth that the United States hasn't seen in 70 years. So what's happening in the rest? I mean, the China story is often told. What's happening in the rest of the region from your point of view economically?
Right. And, because Chinese numbers are not necessarily all that trustworthy, and we know that they're slowing. But we also know that the economy is so huge that even 5% growth in China is still adding several $100 billion a year to the world economy. So it's nothing to sneeze at. But remember that India is growing faster than China already, matter of factly. Some Southeast Asian countries are as well. If you add up South and Southeast Asia, that's 2.5 billion people. If they grow at only 5% for the next 10 years, even though they're growing faster than that, but let's just discount it a little bit. If South and Southeast Asia grow at only 5%, in 10 years, they'll be as large as China is today. And yet, again, we've been ignoring these countries, for way too long, because it isn't one single market the way China is. But of course, these countries are more open. I mean, you have better access to them than you do to China. If you look at, the tech sector, for example, the tech sector has of course been shut out of China for the longest time, but it's growing double digits in Southeast Asia. So what I strongly advocate is that, again, we take a holistic view of Asia and we don't make it also China centric.
What if you were at a casino? I'm sorry, this is a terrible question to ask. I was once on Wall Street, so I think of things in terms of investing. If you were at a casino and you arrayed the Asian countries around the roulette wheel, if you will, where would you be putting your chips, if you will? If you don't mind, that's a horrible question. Where are the economic success stories that we're ignoring? You've just mentioned India, of course, but where else is surprising now?
It's a couple of things. It's next to India in both directions. Southeast Asia is growing remarkably fast. And again, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines are really finally starting to achieve their potential. On the other side, you've got Pakistan, which is very fast growing also. We think of it as like a terrorist failed state, but in fact, it's a thriving economy growing very fast. When I talk to retailers, and supply chain operators and so forth, everyone wants to get into the Pakistan market. It's really, really a great story. Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan that have been frozen for decades have become real centers of growth.
That is fascinating. That is really, truly fascinating. And how's Bangladesh? How about the northern?
Oh, absolutely. And I should have mentioned that too. Is really one of the bright spots in emerging markets, and people are raving about the performance of the textile sector and other areas, and they're really open the economy as well. So, here's the thing. They're growing at different rates, but they're all growing very fast. They're all becoming much more pragmatic in their economic and policy, reforming. They're opening to foreign investment. They've been much more cautious about budget deficits. They're attracting record FDI, growing their trade surpluses, moving towards flexible exchange rates. I mean, all the sensible stuff that you need to do, they're doing.
So China's obviously the big gorilla. I mean, if I may to return to China, I know the story isn't a China story, but how is China operating in a geopolitical sense there in terms of, the United States, and it was the sort of the center, the economic geopolitical center of the Euro North American Western, if you want. The thing is, China's, I guess, has a role to play in the same role to play in Asia. How are they, operating diplomatically and economically and politically within this quickly expanding? Are they treated cautiously, or are they treated, how do the other Asian countries relate to China right now?
It's a great question. Again, it's a central question in the book. China China basically gets what it deserves in this book. It's not 100% of the book, it's like 45% of the book,
Uh-huh.
because China is about 45% of Asia's GDP. It's only one third of its population. So China is very central, but it isn't the whole story. But China is kicking off this next growth wave. As we were saying earlier, you had the kind of Japanese story followed by the tigers, followed by China. And history doesn't end there. Now China is the leading investor in the next growth wave in Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So these countries are benefiting from Chinese infrastructure investment. They're using it to modernize. They're diversifying their economies. They're attracting new investment from the rest of the world because the rest of the world sees that China has decided to bet on these countries. And this is important geopolitically as well, because we tend to look at China's initiative like the Belt and Road as a tool for China to dominate its countries. But in fact, what will happen is that because these countries are gaining more and more confidence thanks to China, they're also gaining the confidence to resist China. And that is exactly how imperial history works.
Mm. Very interesting. I've heard, and again, this book will be a real eye opener for me. I've just seen it comes out in the United States on Monday, so this is very
Tuesday.
timely.
Yep.
Indeed. Yeah, on Tuesday. So they've been investing. I read that they built a high-speed rail or bridge in China and a tunnel in Chile. And what's driving their? I mean, it's all very well to invest in infrastructure in your own country. What's driving this Chinese investment in infrastructure in Africa, Latin America, and I assume even more so in Asia? What's motivating that from the Chinese perspective?
Well, it's all about commodities, right? I mean, if you invest in the Chilean infrastructure, that means that you can get, a copper and other commodities out of the ground and to the ports faster. And along the way, you may build, a highway or a school. I mean, Chile doesn't need Chinese schools, but African countries do. There are obviously social benefits as well. But more broadly, again, if you look at the growth rates of African economies that have been exporting commodities, minerals, oil, gas, agricultural goods to India and China, they're growing very rapidly because it's not only that they produce this stuff, but they can ship it, transport it faster to far off but fast growing and hungry markets in Asia. So in fact, part of the book talks about the return of Afro-Eurasia. And Afro-Eurasia is the term that in global history we use to talk about the era of the pre-colonial world, when Africa, Europe, and Asia traded across the Indian Ocean in these kind of new Silk Roads. And it was a thriving period of kind of global economic history. It was a major wave of globalization, in fact. So Afro-Eurasia is back in many ways, as I discuss in the book. So again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that China is building this infrastructure that helps those countries participate in global trade much more efficiently.
One thing that strikes me as someone who's considered himself, I mean, I've been reading The Economist since I was 17 years old. Most of this strikes me as surprising. I've been guilty of ignoring the rise of Asia, the rise of China, certainly the rise of Asia. I mean, what's going to be the cost to Westerners, to Europeans and North Americans, to ignoring the messages in your book, as we have been up to date? It strikes me that even policymakers in the United States and Europe still have a very Eurocentric or Western-centric view. So what trick are we missing? What's the cost? What's the eventual cost to us?
There'll be serious commercial, economic consequences, because Asia is integrating very rapidly. They're signing lots of trade agreements with each other. Asians trade more with each other than they do with Europe or with America. So if we launch these trade wars, then we wind up cutting ourselves off from their trade with each other, because that's going to happen. And that's going to mean that our multinational companies are going to have lower revenues. Their share prices, their valuations, their market cap are going to fall. So that's one very significant consequence to having the wrong policy towards Asia, which is presently what we do have. But again, when I say we, I really only mean Trump's America. I don't mean Canada. I don't mean the West, because one of the things that I explain in great detail and length in the book is Europe's attitude towards Asia is very different. Europe is embracing these new Silk Roads. Europe wants the Belt and Road Initiative to flourish. Europe wants to have high-speed railways connecting, Britain and Germany all the way to China, because they're the ones who are exporting even more to Asia than we are. So it's critical to realize that we should open our eyes and to see what others are doing more successfully and to learn from them before it's too late.
It's funny, we talk about in the United States, if you listen to Bloomberg News or something like that, they say the trade war, I think, is costing 0.1% right now of GDP per quarter. And the focus is really on the short-term costs of Trump's rhetoric and policy. But we haven't really thought about the long-term costs. And the long-term costs, I think, if I can just, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that the adjustments that the rest of the world are making is the United States is a very risky place with whom to do business right now. And, if we need a foothold in North America, well, why not Canada or Mexico? So the long-term costs, I think this applies to Brexit equally, is that people will look for other partners who are more sympathetic, less mercantilist, less volatile, more globalist in their outlook. So the United States, from my point of view, risks a sort of a real long-term downturn in its economic hegemony, economic and geopolitical hegemony through these policies, like on a 20-year view, not a quarter-by-quarter view. I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that a summary that you can make from a conclusion you can make from your book?
And I do take the view of the 5, 10-year, 15, 20-year sort of prism, and in that sense, what you're describing and what I said before is perfectly logical and sensible, and if you were to paint a picture based on current trends, that is where it would point you. And even just in the North American space, the examples you gave earlier, you do have students saying, I'd rather go to Canada than America. Tuition is cheaper anyway. You've got auto industry saying, Mexico is more advantageous than the US and so forth. So, we tend to, again, every country views itself as the center of the world. But when it comes to global supply chains are agnostic. Supply chains follow the path of least resistance. They don't care for sort of our politics.
Yeah, and volatile trade policies is obviously a huge business risk.
It certainly is. And, without getting too technical, what the U.S. is doing with export controls to limit the export of sensitive technologies that companies like Qualcomm and Intel have to Chinese vendors, on the one hand, it makes sense because you want IP protection. But on the other hand, the way we're cutting them off, or, what we're doing is basically by politicizing trade, we're giving them an incentive to just get those same sensitive technologies from someone else, which is what they're going to do, because America is not the only country that makes semiconductors, microprocessors, and other kinds of chips. You can get them from Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and elsewhere. So their gain will be our loss.
And it's funny, I read that 8 of the, when I was doing my little piece of research on China, 8 of the top 20 tech companies in the world are Chinese. And that just blew my mind, because we think about American technological hegemony as being, irreplaceable source of competitive advantage. But that blew my mind.
Oh, yeah. And that's the thing. The law of technology diffusion is really the real law of history. It's more powerful than any empire. We get our century in the sun, but the law of technology is always circulating. It never stops. It knows no borders.
From China's point of view, they consider themselves to be a sort of when would China begin to call itself a country? Almost 2,000 years ago, is that right? When was China? When could you have called China a country?
A country would be a strong word, because it only became, sort of a modern nation, constrained legal sovereign boundaries after its civil war in 1949. But obviously, as a civilization with very fluid physical space, but certainly a sense of identity, that goes back thousands of years, of course.
Yeah. So they see, if I understand it from a Chinese perspective, they see the American, China, I think China was the biggest economy in the world in 1800, give or take. And they see the last 200 years of American and Western European hegemony as being just a blip on the horizon. They're about to retake their, rightful place as the forerunner of civilization, which is interesting as well, because of course we see ourselves as the forerunner of civilization over here.
Well, the key thing is that, economics and geopolitics and national identity, they relate to each other, but you really can't use them interchangeably. So, for example, this idea that one country is the center of the world economy, that's not the way global economy works, because it works much more according to networks of relationships rather than within national boundaries. So China is only what China is today because of the fact that, again, not only did Japan and Korea and Taiwan invest in China, but it became the center of the world's factory floor in terms of production. China already has a lot of indigenous technology to propel itself. And with such a large population, it will inevitably be the largest economy in the world. But one of the things I explain in the beginning of the book is that the rise of China today as a large economy is not nearly as big a deal as when America was the world's largest economy. Because when America became the world's largest economy, in the
$1900-ish.
exactly, in the early 1900s, and certainly through World War II, after which it was 50% of the world economy. That was a really big deal, right? That was a truly unipolar world economically. Today, China has become the world's largest economy, but it's not 50% of global GDP, like not even close, right? China is rising at a time when Europe is still the world's largest economy, and America is equally big, and now China is really big, and other economies are growing very fast. In other words, there's multiple multi-trillion-dollar economies in the world. So just because China is become co-equal with them, it's very, very different from, it's not about replacing America. China's just coming up alongside America and Europe. And that's what we need to understand. So again, a lot of geopolitical conversations are sort of all or nothing. Who's number one? That's not the way the world works today. You can have five people.
Kind of like adolescent, right?
Yeah, because the pie is still growing, right? So you can have many number ones.
Well, we're in our last, 5 minutes or so. Or it strikes me as that one of the things is that there's a view, at least in the Western press, that globalization is in retreat. And that's only the case if you live in the United Kingdom or the United States. That really, the world belongs to the globalists, the people who think in terms of wholes, not parts. Is that one of your conclusions, I suspect?
Right. I try to conclude on a hopeful note, a promising, optimistic note about, what I call the fusion of civilizations. And it's picking up really on the last point, just like one doesn't replace the other geopolitically, in the imperial cycle. Similarly, culturally, Asia has learned a lot from Europe, a lot from America. It's all about layers of history rather than, sort of rise and decline and victory and defeat. And I give a lot of examples of that, because in Asia today, you have the inheritance of European parliamentary systems, you have American pop culture and values to some degree, and now you've got a new Asian layer on top of that. And one of the things I advocate is that we now learn a little bit from them. And as you can tell, I would advocate that we have slightly more technocratic governance, far-sighted leadership that's focused on overall welfare rather than just special interests. So I believe in what I call the fusion of civilizations, not the clash of civilizations.
One final question that I'm curious about is a strategic advantage that the United States and the Anglosphere have is we have English. And I'm sure you've thought about this, is to what extent that English is the lingua franca of science and the lingua franca of business and the lingua franca to some extent of diplomacy also. To what extent is that confer an advantage that's irreplaceable? Or do you see a future in which, perhaps Mandarin becomes the most, nobody in the world in the year 2050 grows up without learning Mandarin. There's no educated person in the world grows up today without learning English. What's your view on that?
I'm glad you mentioned it because it is something that I've thought about and written about in this book. And, I do have a view about that. And the English language is something special. It does confer what you might call an eternal advantage, on the US or on those who speak English, wherever they may be. Anglophone countries, because the world is not going to learn Chinese, to put it simply. The world is going to learn code more than it's going to learn Chinese. Everyone is growing up learning how to code. Not everyone is learning how to speak Mandarin. And Mandarin is really damn hard. It's a lot harder than coding. So in terms of what the global languages are, and a hat tip to my wife, who is a technologist, and she's the one who's really been thinking about this a lot. She says there are two global languages, English and code, and everything else is a distant third. And I've come to the conclusion that she's absolutely right.
Oh, fascinating. We're all going to speak Ruby on Rails before we speak
Mandarin. Yeah. Well, Python is what my kids code in. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, look, I want to let you get to your lecture. I'm deeply appreciative of that. The book comes out in the United States on Tuesday, the 5th of February. This podcast will come out a little bit after that. Something like that. But congratulations on, yet another really superb looking book. And I can't wait to finish it. And I want to wish you the best of luck with everything.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm again deeply honored to be a repeat offender on your podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, let's stay in touch. Thanks for your time today.
Absolutely, thank you.
And in the closing moments of the show, I want to do a couple of things. One is I want to ask you a question. Which topics would you like me to blog more about? Recaps of books I've read, my Debunk of the Week video series, techniques and tricks for leadership and change management, business-driven how-tos, or other topics? What would you like to hear more of from a blogging perspective? If you've got something, just drop it in the comments or drop it on my website or drop me a personal email. I would love to hear from you. And here's a little fun thing we can do. It's often said that there are only 7 plot types. I've boiled them down to 9. That's a reverse boiling down. I don't know what that would be called. The 7 plot types are killing the giant, like Jack and the Beanstalk or Frankenstein; rags to riches stories, My Fair Lady and Rocky; The Quest, Lord of the Rings, and Raiders of the Lost Ark; Strange New Worlds, The Chronicles of Narnia, Game of Thrones; origins and return home stories, Ulysses and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We have farce and irony, A Midsummer's Night Dream, Candide, La Cage aux Folles, Meaning of Life. We have tragedy, Macbeth, Death of a Salesman, Gladiator, Revenge of the Sith. And we have Rebirth, It's a Wonderful Life, The Search for Spock. Well, it's one of my favorites. And Breaking Bad. So what I'd like to know is, if you're using storytelling in business, what businesses do those remind you of? So what businesses would you say have stories that fit into those categories? I'll review the categories for you one more time. Giant slayers and monster killers, rags to riches, The Quest, Strange New Worlds, origin stories and return home, farce and irony, tragedy, and rebirth. I mean, that's a little fun. And if you don't like thinking about things, I apologize for the diversion, but thank you. And so once again, my new book, Behaviors and Influence, is going to come out about the 31st of March. I'm very excited about it. Please sign up for early releases on my website, paulgibbons.net. And I want to shout out to my Patreon subscribers. Once again, thank you for supporting the show. It means so much. Talk to you next week. To celebrate the launch of the show, and to thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books. Lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy-to-follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.